Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma, Upadhyay. Let's get started.
And independence of Ukraine is restored.
Most of us hoped there will be no war. A lot of us said there will be no war. But we were making statements based on what's rational. The president of Russia has proven that he does not belong to that category. Rational. Who sends tanks and missiles into another country in this day and age? A man who deludes himself into believing that he can retrieve lost Soviet glory. That international law, the sovereignty of another country, the freedom and lives of its citizens do not matter. Vladimir Putin kept deploying troops and lying that he did not want to invade Ukraine. Earlier this month, we were in Kyiv. Every single person we spoke to said, there will be no war. There cannot be a war. We called some of them today. They were looking for bomb shelters to hide. Among them are 20,000 odd Indian students. On Gravitas tonight, as we track the military moves and the world's response, we shall also focus on the plight of the men, women and children who are paying the price for one man's ambition and aggression. Europe is at war. 77 years after the guns fell silent in the Second World War, the continent is back on the battlefield. All the guesswork, all the diplomacy, all the confusion has ended. Russia has invaded Ukraine. The attack began early this morning. Most of Ukraine was fast asleep. They were woken up by loud explosions. As it turned out, they were cruise missile strikes. What did they target? Ukrainian military installations, their weapon depots, their air defense system, their airports. Putin's strategy was precise and effective. Take out Ukraine's defense and support hubs. For the first few hours, there was confusion, what experts call the shock and awe factor. Ukraine did not know what was happening. Was it a full-scale invasion? Was it just aerial bombardment? Or was it a blitzkrieg? Soon videos emerged on social media, videos like this one. Most of them follow the same pattern. First a flash of light, then a large cloud of smoke. The classic example of what an airstrike looks like. And this happened all over Ukraine. Let me pull up a map for you. This map shows all the cities targeted by Russia. The capital, Kyiv, Kharkiv and Kramatorsk in the east. Dnipro in central Ukraine. Mariupol on the Black Sea, Odessa also on the Black Sea, and Ivano-Frankivsk in the west. Is there any strategy to this list? Experts say there is. Crimea in the south is already under Russian control. The east is also effectively in Putin's grasp. Between these two areas is a vast belt of land, Ukraine's southeast, and that's what Russia seems to be targeting. If Odessa and Mariupol fall, Russia can cut Ukraine off from the Black Sea. Plus, it can create a strategic land corridor. How does Vladimir Putin plan to do it? So far, he's following the military playbook. First, take out air defense systems, then soften ground positions with shelling, and finally send in the troops. All of this may sound tactical and overwhelming. So let me simplify it for you. Russia is ripping up international laws and norms. It has abandoned diplomacy. It has rubbished peace. and it has violated the sovereignty of its neighbor. In this war, there will be bloodshed. So far, Ukraine has reported 50 deaths, 40 soldiers plus 10 civilians. There will be refugees. There will be hardships. And the whole world knows who to blame. The president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. Around 5 a.m. today, he addressed the Russian public. He announced military operations against Ukraine. His excuse, denazification of Ukraine.
I decided to conduct a special military operation. It aims to protect people who have been bullied and subjected to genocide by the Kyiv regime for 8 years. For that, we will strive for demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine and will bring to justice those who committed multiple bloody crimes against civilians, including Russian citizens.
Now, just to be clear, President Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. His family was killed in the Nazi Holocaust. Vladimir Putin is accusing the same Zelensky of running a neo-Nazi regime. As far as excuses go, it's a pathetic one. But in war, truth does not matter. What matters is your military might. And Russia's military supremacy was on full display. Their missiles pounded Ukrainian cities. The Kremlin says only defense installations were targeted. But even precision strikes are not 100% accurate. Let me show you some pictures. The first set is from Kharkiv. You can see shrapnel and damaged garbage cans in a playground. Clearly not a military target. The second set is from the capital Kyiv. Again, this looks like a city square. You can see shops and roads around it. Clearly not a military target. Air raid sirens were booming across Ukrainian cities today. The people may not have been prepared for it. But when the bombs actually drop, anything can happen. By now, Ukraine had gathered its wits. President Zelensky first worked the phone line. He spoke to all his Western allies, US President Joe Biden, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, European Union leader Charles Michel, Polish President Andrzej Duda. Then Zelensky addressed his people. Years later, we may look back at this moment when a career comedian became a wartime leader. Zelensky did his best to rally his country.
This morning, dear citizens, this morning has gone down in history. But the story is different, both for our country and for Russia. We have severed diplomatic relations with Russia. Ukraine is defending itself and will not give up its freedom, no matter what Moscow thinks. For Ukrainians, independence and the right to live on their land according to their will is of the highest value.
How is Zelensky mobilizing his army? Any Ukrainian willing to fight has been asked to join the army. In other words, general mobilization. Citizens have been empowered to carry firearms. Healthy citizens have been asked to donate blood. Ukraine is not giving up without a fight. By noon, the first wave of strikes ended. There was a brief lull, and during this time, two things happened. One, there was a massive exodus from Kyiv. These pictures should give you an idea. There were long lines of vehicles queuing up to leave Kyiv. You can barely see the end of this traffic jam. That's how big it is. And two, Russian ground units started crossing over. We're talking about tanks, soldiers and military vehicles. They crossed over in two sectors, from the south in Crimea and from the north in Belarus. Take a look. All these vehicles have one thing in common. The tanks, the trucks, all of them, they have a mysterious marking on them. It says Z, the letter Z. What does the Z stand for? Well, it could be a code name. It could be a special mission. The Kremlin won't say what it's about. Alongside the bombardment, a narrative war is also underway. Russia is claiming major strategic gains. They say Ukrainian soldiers are fleeing, that Ukraine's air defense system has been taken out. Tall claims even for Moscow. Ukraine says they have shot down 5 Russian jets and 1 helicopter. And both sides, needless to say, have rubbished each other's claims. The fear is today's attack is just the beginning, that Putin's endgame is much bigger than this, perhaps completely invade Ukraine. or install a puppet regime. Both scenarios end with a devastated country. How are the Western allies responding to this? Well, their first reaction was along expected lines, criticism and sanctions. The second step was military posturing. NATO has activated quote-unquote defense plans for its eastern allies. Poland is deploying troops to the border, so is Hungary and Slovakia. Another neighbor, Moldova, has declared an emergency. Now, this is all aimed at protecting NATO territory. Frankly, it's of no use to Ukraine. Which brings us to the big question, what happens next? We have identified 3 sectors that could become flashpoints. The first, of course, is Kyiv, the capital, is without a doubt the biggest prize. The second is southeast Ukraine. Most Russian strikes have focused on this region, southeast Ukraine. Like we said, the idea is to link the rebel territory with Crimea. And 3, the Black Sea. And this could be a game changer, the Black Sea. If Russian warships join the fight, Ukraine could be cut off from the waters. Kiev wants to stop this. It is asking Turkey to shut the Dardanelles and Bosporus Straits. Ankara can do this. They've already condemned Russia's invasion, but they're silent on Ukraine's request. Typical Turkey. The next couple of hours are crucial for Ukraine. The West will huddle to decide on a strategy. Putin's plan will unfold gradually. By Friday morning, there will be more clarity on where this is going. No doubt, the whole world's focus will be on Ukraine. But for the people living there, a long and sleepless night beckons. What about Ukraine's allies? What do they plan to do until then? What kind of steps are they mulling against Russia? To discuss this and more, I'm joined by my colleagues, our correspondents from 4 capitals shaping this conflict. We have Simon Marks with us from Washington, D.C., Giles Gibson from Moscow, Rosie Burchett from Brussels, and Chris Jones from London. Hello to all of you. Simon, let's start with you. Joe Biden has vowed to hold Russia accountable. How exactly?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it, Palki? Because we know what he's not going to do. The White House was very clear about that yesterday. He's absolutely not going to put American troops on the ground in Ukraine to defend the country's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki insisted yesterday that he's not going to allow himself to be drawn into a war with Russia. So while there's talk out there in the ether now about the prospect of trying to enforce a no-fly zone over Ukraine in a bid to stop Moscow's aerial bombardment of the country, how on earth could you possibly enforce that without running the risk of being precisely drawn into armed conflict with the Russians? So what the president is expected to announce here today are more sanctions, and he's under enormous pressure to fling every sanction in his arsenal at Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, and quite possibly at Vladimir Putin personally. It's evident that what the Americans unveiled earlier in the week, the sanctioning of a couple of Russian financial institutions and a handful of Russian oligarchs, in no way deterred Vladimir Putin from launching this full-scale attack on Ukraine. Will the White House now perhaps personally sanction the Russian leader himself? They insisted yesterday that option was still on the table. Will they sanction Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, and all the other bureaucrats who dutifully lined up and gave Vladimir Putin their blessing in that sort of North Korean-style National Security Council meeting that was televised in Moscow earlier in the week? And what happens if sanctions aren't enough? What will the United States do if the Russians succeed in unseating the Ukrainian government, deposing Volodymyr Zelensky, and taking control of the country by force? It is very unclear at this point what the United States is willing to do beyond sanctions.
And sanctions, as we've discussed in the past, have not deterred Vladimir Putin. Giles, tell us about the developments in Moscow. Any indications as to how long Russia plans to continue this offensive?
We've had an update in the last few hours from Dmitry Peskov, who is President Putin's official spokesperson, describing some of the aims here of this Russian offensive. He said the aim is the demilitarization of Ukraine. He also talked about the neutralization of military potential inside the country, and he was asked about the timing here, how long this is going to go on for, days, weeks, and he simply said, pretty vaguely to be honest, that the duration of this operation is defined by its effectiveness and its objectives. We are still hearing from Russian military officials here in Moscow this phrase that was first used by President Putin in that dawn address that he gave to the Russian nation, a special military operation. That gives the impression, doesn't it, of a targeted operation, some sort of limited operation in those two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine. Of course, according to the reports that we're getting out of the country, that we're getting from the Ukrainian government, you have explosions in Kyiv, in the capital. As we were just hearing, you have the Ukrainian government claiming that columns of troops are crossing the borders at all sorts of different locations. So clearly, as far as Ukraine and the West are concerned, this is not a special military operation. This is a full-scale invasion.
Rosie, the European Union is set to hold an emergency meeting in Brussels. What's expected from this meeting?
Well, this certainly is held in emergency circumstances. All 27 EU leaders will be coming to Brussels for crunch talks. They'll be trying to plot out their next move on this most complex of geopolitical chessboard. And of course, people's lives are very much at risk here. For the European Union, as a geographical neighbour of Ukraine, what they'll also be thinking about is preparing for a potential refugee crisis. For example, Poland is one of those countries really on the front line there. They'll be thinking about that. They will also be preparing to ramp up sanctions against Moscow. The EU did earlier in the week unveil sanctions which were at the time perceived to be quite decisive and having taken a step forward. Those sanctions included the Russian defense minister. They included the editor-in-chief of the broadcaster RT. But of course, that has seemed to have not deterred the Russian government at all. So the European Union will be trying to plot out what it does next, preparing perhaps for Russian counter-sanctions. That's particularly relevant here in Europe, where there has been, in the past at least, a strong dependence on Russia when it comes to energy. So they'll be trying to work out how to mitigate the impact of potential counter-sanctions. And of course, that's where we might see some behind closed doors disagreement among EU member states. Each member state has its own industries. Each member state has its own key sectors of the economy which might or might not be targeted. So they'll be trying to weigh up among each other to see how best to move forward with this and how best to try and anticipate the next move from Russia, which of course the European Union simply does not know. And I think it would be a very brave analyst who would tell you where Russia is headed next or where the Russian government plans its next move.
Indeed. Chris, the Prime Minister of Britain has called Vladimir Putin a dictator, and he's described his actions as hideous and barbaric. What is expected from London next?
Well, we heard from Prime Minister Boris Johnson earlier on in a statement made at Downing Street, and you're right, he described the actions by Putin as horrific, and he said in that statement that he'd spoken to President Zelensky of Ukraine and said that that Ukraine had the UK's backing. Boris Johnson said that the UK would do all it could to protect democracy and the people of European people's rights to dictate their own future. Now, speaking in that statement, he called upon sanctions, as we've mentioned previously. And before the G7 meeting began, he said this. He said, today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. Remember, there are already sanctions placed on Russian figures from the UK. There are those bureaucrats and banks. The hope is that more sanctions will halt a further Russian advancement into Ukraine. We also heard from Sir Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party here in the UK. He said that Putin seeks division, so we must stand united. So the UK's stance is very clear. Russia must fail, and they're putting in place sanctions to make sure that perhaps becomes a reality.
Simon, final question. What do today's developments mean for Joe Biden? Is it being called another foreign policy failure? Because this is a man who had the front row seat during Georgia, during Crimea, and that clearly seems to have not prepared him to deal with Putin.
Palki, I don't think you can separate this situation that Joe Biden is facing from the botched military withdrawal in Afghanistan, which created so many unexpected questions about his national security credentials. The absolute last thing that this White House wants is for Republicans to be able to brand Joe Biden as the president who lost Ukraine. And already Republicans are out there doing that. Donald Trump was being interviewed on the Fox News channel last night within minutes of the Russian invasion getting underway, insisting that none of this would have happened if he was still in the White House, and saying falsely to the American people, well, this is what happens when you get a rigged presidential election and a weak leader in charge. People like Vladimir Putin take advantage of him. So the White House cannot afford for Joe Biden to become the president on whose watch Ukraine was lost. But as we wait for the president to speak to the American public and the wider world later today, the question is, what is Joe Biden going to do to save Ukraine? What is he going to do to prevent it from slipping firmly back into Moscow's sphere of influence and control? And beyond sanctions, to that, the White House doesn't currently have an answer.
Right. Simon, Giles, Rosie, Chris, thanks very much for bringing us these updates from the capitals that are, as we say, shaping this conflict. We will come to you for more updates. Now, this has been called Europe's darkest hour since the Second World War. In fact, when war broke out, envoys were actually trying to talk peace. An emergency Security Council meeting was underway at the United Nations. And in the middle of it, ambassadors began receiving videos of the attack on their phones. Here's what happened next.
At the exact time as we are gathered in the council seeking peace, Putin delivered a message of war in total disdain for the responsibility of this council. This is a grave emergency.
As we sat in this chamber urging Russia to step back, President Putin announced special military operations on Ukrainian territory.
The Russian ambassador was on the president's chair. His Ukrainian counterpart openly challenged him. Call Putin, stop the war, or step down, he said.
Well, as I said, relinquish your duties as a chair. Call Putin, call Lavrov to stop aggression. And I welcome the decision of some members of this council to meet as soon as possible to consider the necessary decision that would condemn the aggression that you launch on my people. There is no purgatory for war criminals. They go straight to hell, Ambassador.
It was just a little over 9:30 a.m. in India, around 11 p.m. in Washington, D.C., and just about dawn in Europe. The world reacted in absolute shock. U.S. President Joe Biden denounced the attack. He said the world will hold Russia accountable. From New York, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sent a message to Putin. Stop the war in the name of humanity, he said.
President Putin, in the name of humanity, bring your troops back to Russia. In the name of humanity, do not allow to start in Europe what could be the worst war since the beginning of the century.
When explosions became more frequent and videos of airstrikes began circulating on social media, the reactions from world leaders took a more punishing tone. South Korea, for example, said it would join the West in slapping sanctions on Russia. Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said Putin will face the consequences of his actions.
This cannot be a consequence-free action by Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime. And it should send a message to any other regime out in the world that if you go down this path, if you seek to coerce and bully others, then the world should stand together in targeting those who are directly at the centre of these activities. And this is incredibly important.
Canada took a similar line. It said Russia's reckless and dangerous acts will not go unpunished. The Czech Republic said Russia was trampling the principles of European security. Ukraine's neighbour Poland had a message for the people of Russia. Do not support your government in this war, they said. Soon, NATO held an emergency meeting. It said Russia had shattered Europe's peace. NATO Secretary General said the alliance will be boosting its defences in allied territory, putting ships and airplanes on alert and deploying more troops to Eastern Europe.
Russia is using force to try to rewrite history and deny Ukraine its free and independent path. NATO's core task is to protect and defend all allies. There must be no room for miscalculation or misunderstanding. An attack on one will be regarded as an attack on all. This is our collective security guarantee.
Romania called the Russian attack unjustified. Greece said the attack violates the values of sovereignty and independence. Israel, too, put its weight behind Ukraine. It called the Russian attack a grave breach of international order. And Turkey said it supports Ukraine's battle for territorial integrity.
Rusya'nın bugün erken saatlerde Ukrayna topraklarına başlattı.
I would like to begin by saying that we find the military operation Russia launched on the Ukrainian territory in the early hours unacceptable, and we reject it. This step, which we view as against international law, is a heavy blow struck on regional peace, harmony and stability.
Ve istikrarına vurulmuş ağır bir darbedir.
Protests have broken out around the world. The visuals on your screen are from Berlin, where people are asking their government to act immediately, provide military aid to Ukraine and unite against what they call a new Hitler. And British Prime Minister Boris Johnson spoke earlier this evening. He promised massive sanctions against Russia. French President Emmanuel Macron said Russia's actions will have long-lasting consequences for Europe.
We cannot and will not just look away. Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically and eventually militarily. This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Nous avions anticipé ensemble cette crise.
By renouncing on his word, by refusing the diplomatic path, by choosing war, President Vladimir Putin has not only attacked Ukraine, he has also decided to trample the sovereignty of Ukraine.
Et nous sommes prêts. En reniant sa parole,
we will respond to this act of war without weakness, with calm, determination and unity.
Pas seulement attaquer l'Ukraine.
Not all countries, though, are siding with Ukraine. Some have chosen to stand with Russia. Iran is one of them. Here's what Iran's foreign minister wrote on Twitter. The war in Ukraine is caused by NATO's provocative actions. The president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, says Ukraine invited the war, and he tried to explain how.
All these facts that are hidden from media, I'm highlighting them. Say that Ukraine might have wanted this conflict. They did not do anything to prevent it. They were constantly escalating even after the recognition of these republics.
Lukashenko presented no evidence to back his claim, though. What about China? Where does China stand? Well, currently on two boats. Ukraine has been attacked, people have died, but China says this is not an invasion. Here's what a Chinese foreign ministry spokesperson told a reporter earlier today.
You are using a typical Western media questioning method of using the word invasion. China is closely monitoring the latest situation. We call on all sides to exercise restraint to prevent the situation from getting out of control.
Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan is in Russia, but he has not said a word on the war. When he arrived in Russia some 24 hours ago, he called the situation, quote-unquote, exciting. All in all, the world is divided. Either a country is with Ukraine or with Russia. India so far has taken a very neutral stand on this conflict. Speaking a couple of minutes ago, India's Foreign Secretary Harshvardhan Shringla said that New Delhi's topmost priority remains the safety and security of Indians.
You've all seen the sudden and serious developments in Ukraine today. As we speak, there is a meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Security, chaired by the Prime Minister in session, to take stock of this situation. Prime Minister has conveyed at the CCS meeting that the topmost priority of the government is the safety and security of Indian nationals, including Indian students, and their evacuation from Ukraine.
And that, as he said, is the biggest worry for India, the safety of its own citizens. Around 20,000 Indian students study in Ukraine. Some of them have returned home, but many are still stuck. Many more. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi convened a meeting of the Cabinet Committee on Security. In attendance were top ministers, including Defence Minister Rajnath Singh and Home Minister Amit Shah. We've also learned that the Prime Minister spoke to Russian President Vladimir Putin a short while back. Reports say the phone call was sought by the Russian side. Now, in all these meetings and phone calls, India's first priority has been the safety of its citizens. On the 20th of February, the Indian Embassy had issued an advisory. All Indian nationals must return home, students, workers, everyone. If your stay is not essential, you had to return. Just one problem. The tickets were way too expensive, we're told. Normally, a one-way ticket to India is around 20,000 rupees. This week, it shot up to around 70,000 rupees. Not everyone could buy these tickets. And the result was this. Some students returned home. The others chose to stay back and weather the storm. Now the situation has changed. Ukraine is under martial law. The airspace has been closed for civilian flights. One Air India flight had to turn around midway. So the question is, what happens to the stranded Indians? Another flight was scheduled for the 26th of February, plus 4 more until the 6th of March. What happens to those flights? Well, your guess is as good as mine at this point. The Indian Embassy has issued a new advisory today. It's more like a safety instruction manual. Do not leave your home. Always carry your documents and find a bomb shelter nearby. You can imagine what it's like for those students in Kyiv, thousands of miles away from home, airstrikes all around them, their friends and colleagues fleeing the city while they remain stuck. Earlier today, we spoke to some Indian students in Ukraine. They've already packed their bags. If the call comes, they're ready to evacuate.
We are just packing up our bags so that if in case we have to leave, so if the evacuation is done by India, so just in case. But right now the airport is seized by the Russian army.
But will that call come? By the looks of it, this war is not ending soon. And if that's the case, these Indian students could be stuck for a long time. Reports say India is looking at alternative evacuation routes, maybe through Poland, maybe through airports to the west. Either way, the situation is not ideal. Some students are unhappy with the embassy's messaging. They say there was no clarity on what to do. Should they have left or not? Listen into another Indian student.
My college, when I tried to contact them, they were like irresponsible, to be honest. Until yesterday, they were telling, you can go home, you have offline classes. And when I called the embassy day before yesterday, they also told, if you want to leave, you can leave. They were not giving me a yes or no answer. They were telling like, you can do as you want to. So that's my biggest sadness now.
In hindsight, there will be questions. Could more flights have been arranged from India? Could the government have subsidized tickets? Could the advisories have come sooner? But the fact is, nobody could predict this. This war is one man's gamble, and such conflicts do not go according to plan. Plus, India has an impressive track record of running evacuation flights. We saw that in Kuwait, in Afghanistan, and also during the pandemic lockdowns. The key now is not to panic, to keep the communication lines open and to follow the safety advisories. If you're watching us from Ukraine, let me say this. The country is rooting for you, and we hope to see you back home soon. The situation, we understand, is desperate, and it belongs in history. Who would have thought 2022 Europe would look like this? We've recapped the story so far. We've heard the political reactions. We've also seen the situation on the ground. Let's now quickly take a look at the stock market. Today's opening bells collided with loud sirens of air raids. Markets in Russia and Ukraine went into a free fall. The Moscow Stock Exchange fell 30%. The Russian ruble touched a new low. It weakened to 86.93 per dollar. US stocks open in the red. The Dow was down 2.5%. The shelling in Ukraine hit Europe's markets too. In London, the FTSE fell 3%. Germany's DAX fell more than 5%. In Asia, Hong Kong's Hang Seng lost more than 3%. Japan's Nikkei, almost 2%. And China's Shanghai Composite fell 1.7%. In India, the Sensex tanked more than 2,700 points. The Nifty settled below the 16,250 mark. The Indian rupee plummeted 102 paise. And it closed at 75.63 against the US dollar. Let's try and make sense of these numbers. Why is the market taking a beating? Because of the uncertainty. Be it around the geopolitics or the supply chains or the energy prices. Russia, remember, is a key supplier of energy. Around a third of Europe's gas comes from Russia. So does a quarter of the continent's oil. A lot of the pipeline runs through Ukraine. So a war involving these two countries is bound to take a toll on oil prices. So crude oil prices hit a 7-year high. Crude oil surged above $105 a barrel. If this exchange of fire continues, the market will continue taking a beating. Energy will become dearer. And you can expect to pay more at the gas station. Global bank stocks have also fallen. This is mostly in anticipation of Russian sanctions. The West is vowing to cut Russia off, so banks with sizable operations in Russia have taken a beating. Austria's Raiffeisen was down 19%. Italy's UniCredit lost 11% of its value. Going forward, the war is expected to hit commodities too. Wheat, for example. West Asia and Africa import most of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. The war will hit those supply chains. Chances are Russia may also cut off supplies, meaning wheat in West Asia could cost more. What does India import from Russia and Ukraine? Mostly fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, crude and products. But Russian imports are negligible. And not too many ships come from Ukraine either. So there, India is in a better spot. Vladimir Putin has rolled the dice. His troops are marching through Ukraine. Explosions are being heard across Kyiv. The war has officially begun. The question is, how much will the West sacrifice for Ukraine now? How far are Western leaders prepared to go? 4 of them in particular. US President Joe Biden, French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Remember, they vowed to protect Ukraine, come what may. But all they've offered so far are words of condemnation. None of these leaders is sending troops to fight Russia. They've all ruled out a direct confrontation. So the test for them right now is to prove that they're not what Putin has long called them: shallow, pretentious and ineffective, his words. No longer able to act with the kind of strength and purpose required to defeat a determined opponent. That's how Putin sees Western leaders. So what will they do? What options do they have? And how much will these options work? In the next 4 minutes, we'll discuss. For the West, sanctions are their top strategy at the moment. That's what they're betting on. But they're a blunt weapon. Russia is not Iran, remember, or North Korea. Sanctions will be a double-edged sword with Russia. They will hurt Putin, yes, but they'll also hurt the West. Europe depends on Russia for its energy needs, as I just told you. Penalties on Moscow will mean costs for Brussels. They will have to find a way to hit Russia where it hurts, in the pocket. And this includes removing Russia from the SWIFT financial system. What's that? SWIFT is an enabler of financial transactions. It allows you to transfer money from one bank to another around the globe. Removing Russia from this system, from SWIFT, will be the toughest financial step the West can take. It would cut off Russia from international transactions, stop it from accessing profits from oil and gas production. And this is big money we're talking about. These exports account for 40% of Russia's annual revenue. This move could damage Russia's economy immediately and also hurt it in the long term. Has this been done before? Well, not really. In 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, the NATO considered this option, removing Russia from SWIFT. But Moscow threatened an all-out war, and the West backed off. Well, 8 years on, a war has broken out, and the West is still slow on SWIFT. They can't decide if Russia should be cut off. Next option, export controls. And here, too, the ball is in America's court. A U.S. exports control is going to hurt Russia. It'll block access to software and advanced technology that helps run most of our modern world. America's dominance over software, technology and equipment is unparalleled. It has already targeted Cuba, Iran, North Korea and Syria through exports controls. Could Russia be the next in line? Yes, says the New York Times. It says the Biden administration is preparing curbs on Russia's access to US technology. The next option is to target the elites on whom Russia depends. If the world is serious about punishing Russia, it will have to cross some red lines. Go after Russian oligarchs, maybe, the ones staying abroad, who contribute billions to the Russian economy. At least 44 Russian oligarchs live abroad. So does their wealth in Western bank accounts. The US is home to 10 such individuals. The UK has 11. The remaining are in Switzerland, Austria, Monaco, Israel, and several other countries. If the West targets these individuals and freezes their businesses, it might help force Putin's hand. Then, of course, we have the military option. Western deployments so far are designed to defend NATO territories, not to limit the Russian advance or provide Ukrainian forces with active assistance. And the West needs to look at these options carefully, because how this war plays out will set the template for other expansionist regimes. And we can't end the show tonight without telling you about the people of Ukraine. Until Wednesday, they were going about their daily routine. Today, their lives were upended in a matter of hours. They were seen running for cover, struggling for survival. 10 people have died, 10 civilians, scores have been injured, and thousands are fleeing their country. The highways are choked with traffic. There are long queues outside ATMs. The bombing is expected to continue. What did the people of Ukraine do to deserve this? What was their crime? Here's a report.
Tanks, helicopters, missiles, and troops all descended upon Ukraine this morning. Civilian apartments were bombed. Military command centers were hit. International flights diverted their routes. And the people of Ukraine were forced to flee. These visuals are from Kyiv, which has been gripped by panic. Terrified citizens are huddling in groups, waiting for the next bus to take them away.
I'm going to my parents. They are living in the middle of Ukraine, and I think it's safer there.
The city's streets are choked with traffic. Everywhere you turn, there's a long line of cars on their way out of the capital.
I myself am from Lviv. The mood is patriotic. I will take my children away and return. We will fight this off. Ukraine will win no matter what.
Where exactly are these people going? Most of them are headed to stay with their relatives in safer cities. Others are crossing over into Poland, too scared to risk their lives by staying back.
Really, we are feeling bad because it was unexpected, and we all want peace and quiet. We don't want war. Please, stop, because people suffer from it, and we must go out of the country because we have no other choice. But we are students. We have some obligations to study.
Those who have stayed back have taken shelter in their homes. They're sharing videos of Russian bombardments, expressing their disbelief at the turn of events. On the front line, Ukrainian soldiers are equally startled. One such soldier shared this video, telling his parents how much he loved them.
Every 5 minutes bomb is dropping by Russian army.
Короче, нас поебашили сразу. Хорошо, что все живы пока. Если что, мама, папа, я вас люблю, все будет нормально.
In the city of Kharkiv, many have lined up outside hospitals. They're donating blood to create reserves for exceptional situations. The hospital says at this moment it's not clear how much blood reserves Ukraine might need.
We are forming reserves. At the moment, we are forming reserves, but whether they'll suffice or not, I can't tell as of now.
In the city of Mariupol, the situation is the most devastating. Located right next to Russia's border, it was rocked by explosions throughout the day. Scores of people were injured. One such resident who was injured in an explosion gave a chilling account of the trauma she experienced.
I never thought that such a thing could happen. I never thought that this would truly happen in this lifetime. I wrote poems about the war. I myself am a director and educator. We studied the history, but we never thought that this would happen on our land. The house is completely destroyed. There are no windows, no doors, one door even flew out. Even the floor has been completely ripped off. I'm just very lucky. I must have a very strong guardian angel for me to have stayed alive.
The situation right now is truly a nightmare for the people of Ukraine. One day they were going about their daily lives, another day they are fighting for survival. What have they done to deserve this? Well, too many of them demanded a future that looked to the West and not towards Moscow. And that is their only crime.
That is a wrap on this edition of Gravitas, but our coverage of this war continues, and our thoughts and prayers to the people of Ukraine. Thanks for watching.